In any payments business, my old-fashioned way of saying it takes two hands to clap. It means you need a seller, a merchant, and you need a buyer. Right? When the seller and buyer come together, a payment is made. For the seller, which is what we look after, where we are the acquirer for the merchants, we ensure that the merchant can take payments. In this case, can take nets. We can also provide other forms of payments to the merchant. In payments, there's always the commonly called the chicken and egg question. Right? Through my experience in payments, I've always been biased towards the seller side. The more merchants you have, the more buyers will come. In all my experiences, from starting a network, or the power that differentiates one network from another comes from the number of acceptance points. So having acceptance points to me is extremely important to try to break the chicken and egg. And I think we at Nets, today we claim and we have more than 150,000 points. And today this number is growing very much, not just from the retail normal shops that you walk into, but another growing segment for us is also vending machines.
Welcome back to TFC Business Show. I'm your host, Reggie, aka your Chief Financial Coconut, and I'm joined with my new co-host.
My name is Judson. Pardon me if my stomach will growl later because this guy slave drives us.
Hey!
No time
that's
to
not
eat
great
lunch
for
one.
recruitment effort. Okay. But yes. So today we are in studio with, I think CEO of one of the biggest, most established private company around in Singapore. But before we go there, maybe Judson, you want to share with us what are some things that you want to go through today with our amazing CEO?
I'm a very hardworking producer. Oh, sorry. I know that Singapore being a financial hub, we are here, we are where we are today, must be because of, the great things, the correct things that we have done in our payment system since decades ago. So today I just want to know, and by the way, I interned in this company before, years ago also, so it's a full circle moment for me to be able to speak to the group CEO of Nets and understand the trajectory and the future plans. Are they listing or not?
So we're not here to force them on their hands, but very happy to be joined in studio with Lawrence.
My name is Lawrence Chan. I'm the group CEO of Nets. I have the privilege of leading 3 business entities in the Nets group. One where everyone knows the common man in the street, we're very familiar with either through the card they use in their RU in their car, or they use our card for transit, for MRT or buses, and with all the terminals that you see around Singapore, where we are the National Debit Payment Scheme. So that's commonly known as the Nets entity business. 2 other businesses which are not so much familiar with consumers is one is called BCS, where we are the payment infrastructure, the utility for almost all payments in Singapore, namely the traditional checks to today the most well-used and growing PayNow and Fast, and including Gyro as well. And the third company is called Net Solutions, where we help build the payment infrastructure for MES as a central bank and even for other central banks.
You're literally the kingpin in the payments industry. 30 years.
It's like the Visa of Singapore, right? Essentially, right?
Yeah.
The Visa came together because all the big financial giants decide that, okay, we will set up this entity together to run it in a unison form, right? And from my understanding, that's kind of how Nets started, right?
Nets started, and it's still the same today in terms of equal ownership by all the local banks in Singapore. So when it started 40 years ago, all the local banks in Singapore had an equal ownership till today, where we have 3 local banks in Singapore. The 3 local banks have an equal ownership in Nets as well.
Okay. And it's not a GLC in that sense. Or indirectly.
No indirect. It is directly owned by the 3 local banks in Singapore. It's of course a very heavily regulated business by our financial regulator, which is the MAS.
The thing about Nets is that I think when it comes to the consumer-facing side, maybe many people are not aware that of Nets' role in empowering through the payments local infrastructure. So maybe you could share with our viewers and listeners in the sense that on a day-to-day basis, when you make a payment in a cafe, $5 matcha latte, how does Nets come into play?
I'd like to start by saying that within the 2-3 years before COVID hit, it was, I think, difficult because we were also in different buildings, different geographies, different part of Singapore for the whole management team to come together. And we then came out with our purpose statement. Right? And I think through my experience, I think in other companies, having a purpose is very important. Having the the words articulated is important, but more importantly is to have each individual have their own narrative or storyline that is aligned to those words. And so the 4 words we chose is connecting communities, empowering lives, right? And these 4 words may sound very general. It can be for payment company, it can be for many things, but it really is applicable to everything we do in Nets Group, where we can connect communities. Today, we not just can connect communities within Singapore, we can connect cross-border as well. You can do a pay now transactions overseas. You can scan a QR when you're overseas, and likewise when they come to Singapore, they can do the same. And we can empower lives, right? From the smallest matcha seller every morning, I always say to the team, I have the privilege of, when I buy my 2 eggs and teh siew dai in the morning, to the largest transaction that takes place, we really have the responsibility of making sure it happens, right? To the extent that if it doesn't happen, then people know we exist, right? But when it happens, people just assume that's part of life, right? And that's how much we have promised our customer that use digital payments. And when you use digital payments, because we promise them it works, we have to make sure. We have to make sure we're resilient, make sure that it continues to work day after day, hour after hour.
I'm just concerned that maybe some of our viewers might not be familiar with the payment system work, the payments network, right? So of course I could do my homework, boss. I understand that Nets is both a scheme and an acquirer. Scheme in the sense that, Visa and Mastercard, they are also schemes. But acquirer is very different. Acquirer is that in the sense that they process the transaction. So today, if your $5 matcha, you can pay with the glamorous black card or whatever. Without acquirer, then your payment cannot go through lah. Am I translating it correctly?
Well done.
Okay.
Well done.
My interning years, 20 years ago, did not fail me.
So how is that business kind of? What is the mechanics of the business?
So in any payments business, it's always my old-fashioned way of saying it takes 2 hands to clap, right? To get the transaction, it takes 2 hands. Means you need a seller, a merchant, and you need a buyer, right? When the seller and buyer come together, a payment is made. So for the seller, which is the merchant, which is what we look after, where we are the acquirer for the merchants, we ensure that the merchant can take payments. In this case, can take nets. And I'll explain later, we can also provide other forms of payments to the merchant. But basic is he must take nets before he takes other forms of payment that we provide, right? So for the seller or the merchant, we make sure that he can take. And then the buyer, we don't have a contract with most of the buyers. Most of the buyers actually comes from our banks. So we have 6 banks today, 3 are the local banks and 3 foreign banks. We're there. Savings account, current account holders who have a Nets card can then use their phone to scan a QR to pay at these merchants, right? So in a typical payment transaction across the whole world, including the Visa Master model, somebody has to pay the price. So who pays the price for these transactions? Typically, unless for exceptions, typically it is the merchant. The merchant pays the price, and therefore we have to articulate the value to the merchant why you should take nets. You should take nets because the price is this relative to your other competitive payment options because of the value we bring you, and then we have to articulate what is our value to them.
So what's the price?
I cannot find on your website.
No, because from what I understand, originally, the competition, it's the value proposition is about cheaper than Visa, cheaper than Master, so that's kind of the value prop, right? But over time, with a lot of these like e-wallets and all that, right, the competition has changed, right? So maybe help us understand a little bit, like how is the business, of payments, how much do they pay and all that, just so I get an idea.
I prefer not to share that number, but I would say definitely we are not the cheapest in Singapore today. We're not the cheapest payment option in Singapore, and therefore we have to articulate our value, right? Today, we have 3 very what we call form factors that are used at our merchants. One form factor is the traditional PIN. So we still have a percentage of customers that still would use the PIN. We have a very strong, high percentage, growing, very strong percentage of tap, right? So they use the cards and they tap at the point of sale. And the fastest growing since COVID is actually scan to pay, which is QR. So depending on the form factor, some form factors are terminal-led, means you scan a QR on the terminal, you tap a terminal, you put your card into a terminal. Some form factors are non-terminal-led, just paper-led, where you can just scan a paper QR that you typically would see when you go to a hawker center.
I think for large companies that has existed for many decades, right, they typically go through a trajectory whereby of ups and downs. And would you say that the COVID pandemic, because of SGQR, led to a boost,
A revival.
a revival of nets and the in terms of innovation and stuff like that? It's actually is SGQR the largest vertical in terms of your payments?
No, it's not. It is but a growing vertical. It is a growing form factor, as we call it, right? As you rightly said, nothing good came out of COVID. Rather, there are many bad things that came out of COVID, including deaths, right? But if there's any silver lining for us from a payment standpoint, especially here in Singapore, where every building we entered, we had to scan a QR. That gave, I think, the man in the street, the consumer, the confidence of a QR or the knowledge or the education of a QR. So scanning a QR for payments then became less of a education that we had to make. I like to borrow the term that it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to raise a new form factor, right? So this form factor of scanning a QR, starting with hawker centers, required not just nets, but a huge government-led initiative at that time, even to drive the education of our merchants, the education of our consumers who are at hawker centers to have the confidence to use QR as a form of payment.
So what is the biggest form factor at this point in time?
From a dollar standpoint, it is still PIN, because after a certain amount, you still have to PIN.
It's still PIN.
Yeah, after a certain amount, you still have to put your PIN. Tap, it is still a growing form factor. And as you know, the younger generation today probably don't carry a wallet. And so scan to pay is a very much growing form factor, especially for the younger generation.
Interesting. Wow.
Actually, the scan to pay
When was the last time I used a PIN? So I'm clearly not the...
You are not a big spender. You're not the target audience.
Okay. Please go carry on. Yeah, you say?
No, what I meant to say is that actually I think the Hawkers Go digital initiative is very, very well done, because I prefer my $1.70 kopi, and every single day before I go to work, I will go down and buy, and then I use GrabPay. But because the GrabPay is integrated with SGQR, and then the auntie, she doesn't believe me one. You know, the typical consumer journey is I scan, I show the auntie pay already. She don't want to look at my phone, she'll look at your nets. I don't know whether she's using a soft pause, but the interface definitely shows nets. She'll wait for maybe 3 seconds. Ding, and then okay, you can go now. If don't think right, she will not let me go. She's like, I don't care your screen, you need to pay me the 170. So that's how ingrained and embedded it is, today in terms of scanning QR codes.
Yes, that's very true. And thanks for doing the research, because it was called the Hawker Go digital program. We really had to educate the merchants not to look at the consumer's phone, because we have also encountered fraud where the consumer used a screenshot of yesterday's transaction, so another time transaction, show the merchant I paid, but actually haven't paid yet, right? So we actually train our merchants to listen to the sound from the app that we make them download onto their own phone. And we call this the NetsBiz app. This NetsBiz app, when it's downloaded into the phone, for an Android, it will not only give the sound, it even say out the amount. iOS, unfortunately, can't say out the amount, just gives a sound. But with this is what we call the handshake is done. When payment takes place, both the seller must be convinced, I can give you my char kway teow when I know I'm paid. I cannot just give you the char kway teow if I don't know I'm paid. From a buyer standpoint, I need to know that my money has gone through, right? So when I check later to reconcile, then I know that, and this, both the buyer and the seller knows it through the thing that you hear in a common marketplace.
Okay, great. Now for some CEO level questions. All right, we've laid the ground on this is how the payment business works. I think the first question I really wanted to ask was essentially, how do you articulate your new value proposition, since you've rightfully kind of very frankly tell everybody now you're no longer the cheapest option, right? Because I do think from a merchant usage standpoint, from a long period of time, people use Nets because it's very cheap, right? Much cheaper than the other competitors, right? But now that you say that, okay, we are no longer the cheapest options, how do you kind of translate that, value and articulate to your customers and make sure they stay and grow with you?
It's always important to know the size of the pie and the right to win, right? What gives us the right to win? And right to win to me is a value proposition. What value are we articulating to the person who's paying us? So the person or the entity that's paying us is the merchant, Why would the merchant want to pay us a fee slightly higher than an alternative payment option? I think very important for any payment transaction is that the payment takes place and the merchant knows he has been paid. As important is to know how to reconcile that payment. As merchants get bigger in size, reconciliation becomes more and more important. If I'm a merchant that sells one item, I have one payment point, easy for me to reconcile. If I'm a merchant with one store but multiple payment points within that one store, more difficult. And of course, it gets even more difficult if I have multiple stores with multiple payment points. Reconciliation of payments is very important because in almost every payment, there would also be occasions where there would be disputes of payment. So the reporting that we can give, the support that we can give, despite us being marginally higher, can justify the price difference that we charge. Also with the understanding that we have the privilege of being owned by our 3 shareholder banks, the local banks, plus another 3 foreign banks. And thus we have more than 90+% of all consumers in Singapore that will use our product. Right? So almost every Singapore resident would have our product to use, whether through the phone or through a card. And therefore, we have almost all the buyers domestically. Today, that has been our value proposition, if I may say, until COVID. After COVID or during COVID, we worked very hard to do what we call cross-border. Today, we can do a payment when you and I go to Malaysia, to Thailand, to Indonesia, to scan a QR, even to China. Right? And we can scan a QR through the local bank apps. Likewise, when they come to Singapore, they can scan our QRs as well. So a QR can be scanned either directly or through paper or directly through a terminal. Today, we have cross-border that can make a transaction at our merchants as well. So especially for the long-tail merchants in the heartlands of Singapore, we can now tell our merchants the value proposition we bring is even a foreigner in Singapore today, we can bring you new customers that you never had before. They had the struggle of changing local currency to be able to buy with you. Now they can buy with you directly through their bank apps.
Do you have some data to share around that? After you integrate with foreign payment systems, which I've seen, you guys went around, because back then I was staying in KL, right? So I was like, oh, there's an integration here, right? With Touch and Go and the whole gang, right? And then of course, OCBC was pushing a lot of this whole like, oh, you're in Hong Kong, you're in China, just use the app, right? And you guys are the backbone essentially, right? But to translate that kind of value proposition to the end merchants, do you have some data to share? Like, how has that improved their ROI?
From a data to the merchant standpoint, it comes down to the incremental transactions, right? And to some extent, that's the real value we bring, right? And a lot of these countries I mentioned, they actually also have residents who are staying in Singapore, working in Singapore, who still have their bank accounts and their local bank apps from the country that they come from. And sometimes they may not want to use the money given to them in Singapore. They may want to use their savings back from the whole country, and they can still access that money to make a payment here in Singapore, right? And today, a large majority, if I may say, of all our merchants see at least one, right, non-Singapore transaction in that comes from Nets.
To be fair, right, you guys did not organically become more expensive, right? Like I remember from a long time ago, there was a woo-ha on the news. Nets increased price. There was I don't know if you remember. The news covered it, right? And you kind of made a strategic choice in my point of view, right? So just wanted to understand, like, at what point do you decide, or maybe not you, your predecessor decided, okay, we cannot be the cheapest one anymore. We got to change and move down a different path.
Actually, not that I don't recall it that way. It was definitely before my time, but from what I recall being in the industry as well, although not with Nets, but being in the payments industry, what happened was Nets actually didn't increase price. It was other providers that had a lower price point.
Okay. So then inorganically you become the...
And then because of that, we become not the cheapest price point. But it's not that we decided to increase our price point.
Okay. Fair.
But it sounds like there's a demand and supply side, and you are thus far, it sounds like it's merchant heavy. Your main target audience is merchants, but without consumers, then your merchants also don't have business, right? And so when I look at the different schemes, let's say Mastercard has its own priceless rewards program. Visa also has always ties up with issuers and do first dips in concert tickets, for example. And so from a consumer perspective, is there anything that's preventing you from having a consumer-facing, high-touch loyalty ecosystem kind of play, like link points from NTUC FairPrice? Why not? Why don't you play in that space?
From all the examples that you have quoted, most or if not all of the loyalty points are provided by what we call the issuer. And most of the time, the issuers can only provide these loyalty points for credit products. Because for credit products, the margins are much higher. For credit products, the transaction margin is higher, plus because there is more credit losses, plus the fact that also for credit products, what they call in the business, people who don't pay on time, they revolve. That also adds to the positive economics of a credit product. So credit products, loyalty points are very prevalent in terms of differentiating itself. But for debit products, where in a way we don't charge enough to be able to give back in loyalty points, it is more challenging to provide loyalty points. Yeah, but having said that, today even we have some form of preference, and that is led by the bank issuers. Yeah, if you use my debit product versus another bank's debit products, you can get this, you can get that, whether it's from a scanning or through the mobile app or through card payments.
Or maybe because the actual reason is that they have 90% of the market share in Singapore, so no need to acquire.
There's no question about acquisition, right?
Yeah.
They're very market dominant.
No, it is still important to be able to convince consumers to use, right? And so they do among the issuers themselves, they do try to differentiate themselves as well.
What about from Net's point of view, right? Like how active are you guys in acquiring? I mean, of course you'll say very active lah, but I want to know like what's the kind of strategies that you deploy, that could be, of wisdom to other CEOs in that sense.
I mentioned just now my analogy of payments is takes two hands to clap. In payments, there's always the commonly called the chicken and egg question, right? Do I sign up merchants first, or do I get more consumers?
All marketplace face these problems.
All two-sided business have this concern, right? And maybe I'm biased, but I've through my experience in payments, I've always been biased towards the seller side. The more merchants you have, the more buyers will come.
Is that where did this idea come from? I mean, bias takes experience to form, so just want to understand.
So in all my experiences, from starting a network, or the power that differentiates one network from another comes from the number of acceptance points. If you can imagine any of the payment options that doesn't have enough acceptance points, what it used to be called, I used to call the cancer of the business, is when the transaction is suppressed. I try to use, I cannot use, especially in Asia, I feel paiseh, right? People think I got no money. But actually because the merchant doesn't take my payment option, which I try to use. So having acceptance points to me is extremely important to try to break the chicken and egg. And I think we at Nets, today we claim and we have more than 150,000 points. And Singapore is very small. And how do we keep growing this, right? And today this number is growing very much, not just from the retail normal shops that you walk into, but another growing segment for us is also vending machines. Right, with more and more vending machines coming up all over, even below our office now, there are vending machines that not just sell drinks, but even food, right? We have to make sure we are available as a payment option. How
do you make sure that? Because a lot of these vending machines I buy from China, I just import the whole thing in and I'll stock it up, and... Like
any business, there are channels. So we have to understand the channels that are being used and how do we address the channel hit so that the coverage is there.
Okay, so you would say most of your acquisition strategies are very high level, meeting the channel partner at the top rather than like...
Yes and no, both, right? So when we go to the heartlands and we sign up Lauren's Shoe Shop, Right, we have to go talk to Lawrence to get Lawrence Shoe Shop to sign. When I'm talking a vending machine that sells food or different brands of drinks, I have to go to the vending machine, talk with the channel partner.
Actually, I also want to share a little bit on any business that is two-sided, right? Because the media business is a two-sided business, right? You gotta engage the audience and you gotta engage the sponsor pool, right? Essentially, that is the dynamics of a two-sided business, right? And I have also come to become, relatively biased to the sponsor pool. Not that I diminish my value proposition to the audience, because the audience tune in, they find value in it, all that. But I spent a lot of effort with the sponsor pool, and that's the only reason why I'm still around, right? Relative to a lot of the other, media houses that are much bigger and they have very good traction, but they're all, they're not doing that well because they have a different bias. So ultimately, every business there is an ecosystem. You kind of find the cracks, right? Like where you tackle the game at, right? So from your many years of payment wisdom, you think that the merchant angle is the correct angle, right? To kind of tackle that. Yeah. So maybe can you give me a little bit more color, since you are biased to the merchants, right? How do you do like customer engagement? Like how do you kind of run those kind of strategies to make sure your customers, because you don't just sign them up, right? So how do you kind of engage them and keep relevant? All this account management type of stuff.
Yes, it's true that because we have 100 over 1,000 touch points, we have 10 million cards. Of course, we don't have 10 million residents in Singapore, right?
Singaporeans have too many cards.
Yeah, so we have 10 million cards, and that doesn't even include mobile devices they can scan to pay. We have a lot of data. Again, as Nets, I don't know the data of Lawrence Chan, how old, where he lives, what he buys. I may not know Lawrence Chan by name, by age, but I know the people that look like Lawrence Chan from the spending behavior. I know Lawrence Chan has a car, not because he pays his petrol, because most people pay petrol by credit card, but because he go and service the car, he pay by nets. He go and change the tire, he pay by net. So I know he's a car owner, right? I know Lawrence Chan got children because he buys from shops that cater to children. The truth is, in Singapore and around the world, I would say all face-to-face merchants do not know who their buyers are. Online, they know because they make them fill out a form, they make them fill up the app, they would know. But almost all face-to-face merchants do not know. And that's where we really can add value. Because we are the network in Singapore and we know the spend behavior across the network, we can help merchants understand, again, not by name of the individual, but by customer profiles. We can compare against a competitive set. Hey, actually, your parent with child is very low compared to your competitors. Oh, but your tertiary students, because you have maybe more locations in the West, is higher than your competitors. Right, so this kind of data, when I first introduced this to Nets when I joined, and I went to see merchants, merchants really appreciate it, but they don't know how to use because they didn't even hire the right people. Today, they not only hire the right people, the demand is so high. We recently had to move our big data to the cloud on AWS because the demand for this has increased, and we are now helping merchants really understand who their buyers are. So this is one value add. Of course, there are many other value adds. Reporting, as I earlier mentioned, is the other. But I think through this data value add of not only knowing the customer profile, sometimes we can even help them validate where they want to open the next store. Go back to Lawrence Shoe Shop, right? Lawrence Shoe Shop, I can tell Lawrence Shoe Shop that 80% of all your customers, before they come and see you, they're going to Mall A. The last transaction was in Mall A. If you're thinking of opening your next shop, maybe you should go into Mall A because all the before transactions are in Mall A. If you open your next store, you may want to go to Mall A first compared to any other place. So our data has been now warmly received in terms of merchants really trying better understanding who their buyers are.
Yeah. This is essentially, I'm not sure if every one of you heard of this company called Square in the US, right? So it's like a POS payment system, right? Then they also gather all this information. And back then, many years ago, when I was looking at this company, I thought, this is a very interesting company. Why don't we have something that is, assembling like that, right? But I think you've essentially integrated that type of analytics, that kind of back-end information. Because to the merchant, it's very simple. Right? You want to take money from me, very simple. Teach me how to make more money out of this thing, right? So with all the info, I can be more predictive with my, productization, with my promotion elements and all those
and
kind of
nowadays with
stuff.
social media, you can communicate based on customer segment, right? When you do an ad, you can only show this ad to a certain customer segment, and that's really how we encourage the communication so that they can grow a specific segment or cement a certain segment that they're really strong in.
Fair. And this is a free service to your...
We don't charge.
Oh, wow.
I was about to ask because I was about to gently challenge that because Mastercard also have their own insights team. Visa also has their own insights team. They also sell to these insights to merchants. Then I was about to ask how do you differentiate? How does Nets differentiate this insight service away from the other schemes? Until you say it's free. Okay.
Free lah, free we give you.
Free, yes.
Yeah.
No, I think as I shared from the different companies I've come from before, I've learned and I try to bring the best practice to the local players in Singapore. Right, many of these companies you mentioned offer it to the top 1 or 2 in any country. Now our Singapore brands have the privilege of knowing the customers better because of the data that Nets can provide.
Fair. So is this are you gonna move down the predictive part of the business?
I think that's a natural step, right? There's a natural step once data is being used. How not only we can use data better, but even our merchants can use the data better with the insights that we can give.
Yeah, and then is there like a capital business that's coming? As with many of these guys, right? Alipay, a lot of these global giants, they all have a similar kind of trajectory.
I think there's a difference here, right? And in our payment business, we call it the closed loop or the open loop, right? The closed loop is where the contract with the buyer and the seller is through one entity. So you mentioned Ali, American Express. These are closed loop systems where one entity signs up the buyer, signs up the seller, signs up the merchant, signs up the consumer. In our model, we call it the open loop model. We sign up the seller, we sign up the merchant. The buyers are signed up by somebody else. Right, so we focus really on the merchant in our model. So it is slightly different.
Yeah, fair. I get it.
What would be your maybe a 5-year innovation plan?
Definitely, we have a transformation plan. Right, definitely, we are always. I use this word carefully because I think we have to be, and yet we cannot be overly consumed by it. And we have to be paranoid. We have to be paranoid that somebody's eating my lunch and I will not be relevant tomorrow. In fact, in 2025, in January, when we had our kickoff meeting, our theme for 2025 is relevance and resilience. Right? It's important for us to be resilient because we are very relevant today. But we cannot assume that we'll be relevant tomorrow. Right? So to be relevant, we need to continue to innovate and transform ourselves. The growing form factors, as I talked about earlier in the conversation, is due through the innovation that has happened with a bit of wind at the back of our backs in terms of scan or QR payments. Right? But we have to continue to innovate, and we're looking at different ways in which we can innovate. Data has been one way we have really tried to innovate. Another, something that we have given a focus is what we call merchant solutions. Right? How do we provide solutions to our merchants over and above payments? Because we provide you with payments, what else can I help you with your business? Right? You probably heard that we've launched Soft POS. Right? Soft POS is where a transaction can take place through a card that does not need a terminal. So we just give a software, and that software can be placed to almost any hardware, including their own personal phone, to be able to take a card transaction. And the card transaction can be Nets, can be the international schemes or Visa Master as well. And we can sign Lawrence Shoe Shop, Lawrence Chan Shoe Shop, to be with Soft POS and can take international payments and can take Nets.
From a hardware level, it's because there are all these computer chips inside.
So we will own the software. We will put the software into their hardware.
Into hardware.
So if I just, we all eat a lot. Almost any F&B merchant you go to, you see a lot of delivery terminals, right, at the counter. And those terminals are not payment terminals, but the delivery business. So theoretically, any of those terminals can even be used for payment. But today it's used for delivery, and then there's another terminal for payment.
But as with all merchant organizations, right? I think there's always a tension between keeping the things as they are versus moving forward with innovative solutions. And especially, I think in your industry, in payments industry, things need to follow a certain set of rules, especially when you're fighting scams, when you need to protect privacy and everything. So from a CEO perspective, right, how do you manage this tension between the need to be conservative because you're in payments industry, but the need to also lurch forward because of innovation. What is your management style in encouraging this kind of culture?
So I use the example of our team for this year, resiliency and relevance. It is an expression of the tension that you just mentioned. We cannot take our eye off being resilient. We cannot afford for the transaction not to take place when a customer wants to pay, when a merchant needs to receive a payment. We have to be there. It's almost like utility lights. You walk into the room, you expect the aircon and light to be on. If you want to make a payment, it has to be there. The moment it doesn't happen, and if it happens too often, people lose trust in us. And we tell our consumers, we are safe, secure, available anytime you want. So we have to be resilient, not just from a regulatory standpoint, but because that's the promise we make to our customer set. At the same time, we have to innovate. As I mentioned, because people are eating my lunch, and I got to make sure that I continue to be relevant. It is a balance, right? So it's the balance I have to keep on trying to press on the accelerator, reduce a bit on both sides to make sure that we are always moving forward in the correct manner.
Can you give me a little bit more color? So let's say today, maybe the story is, prior to your maybe Nets is not as risky, right? It's a stable, dominant guy out there. And then you join the organization and say, hey, we need to be more relevant, right? We want to take on some of these new verticals. We want to be more risky, right? You know that, right? You convince your board, everybody agree, align, right? Okay, then how do you kind of translate that new energy into the wider organization, right? Like maybe just share with us some thoughts around
like
here.
For example, right, certain organizations, they set out sandbox teams that have the free reign to just innovate. I think Huawei is a great example. The reason why Huawei is at its place today is because maybe decades ago they have a sandbox team whereby they allocate 10% of the company's resources to that team. And the team is given free reign to just innovate whatever. The technologies that they innovated 20 years ago became embedded in all the mobile phones today. So some companies do it that way. And so I think what we are trying to understand is, what is your way? Yeah.
I always say to my team, it's important to define reality and to give hope. Right, so we need to really understand where we are in our space and what are the things we can do to get better from where we are today. And I think in the main, we are not at the cutting edge of those names, those company names you mentioned. And just by looking at what is available in the marketplace that we are not doing, and there's already a gap there, we can do. I used data as an example earlier on, even softball as an example. We're not the first in the world to do this. But the gap that exists from what the best in class in the world offers and what we are doing, we can do. And then how do we manage and how do we prioritize what's available that others are doing? Even scanning a QR before COVID, China was leading the way in QR. Right? All these things is we can do that already exists elsewhere. And how do we prioritize this relative to my technical debt? Relative to my investments I need to make sure that from a cyber standpoint, I'm very secure. So these are the balances that we need to ensure. But that doesn't mean I stop looking out what's happening. I always have to look out and see what's happening, because that gap, it can keep on getting bigger if I'm not aware what's happening outside.
Fair. Okay. I understand. Yeah, so he brought up the idea of engineering debt, right, essentially. So can you give me a bit more color on this? Because, okay, certain organizations, they have their own kind of like a breakdown on agar-agar. We know how many percent have to be reinvested into the network, how many percent have to be reinvested through marketing. There's a bit of a business reinvestment element, on top of headcount, right? I think that's an important part of all big, tech businesses and that front, right? Do you have some of these, things that you can share with us on, like, okay, you have to do this is inevitable in this business?
Yeah, it's definitely inevitable from a resiliency standpoint that we understand from what is end of life, what is end of service, what is the new infrastructure that we want to bring. I mentioned just now in terms of soft POS that we would like to introduce. How does that complement the terminal business that we continue to have today? And what does the point of arrival look like relative to what we have today? So these are the things where we have to form points of view and then plan against it. And in the meantime, we still have to make sure that we meet all the compliance requirements, whether it is from not just a regulatory compliance, but even from industry-wide compliance from a safety and security standpoint.
So, like you have all these data, on like how are consumers spending or how are merchants transacting and then from there infer how are consumers spending, right? Essentially that's the situation. So why do you think so many shops are closing down? What is your data telling you that, what's happening in the consumer market? Just so we get a sense of this.
No, I think the number of shops closing down, it's common within certain industries, right? More common within certain industries. I think traditionally, F&B, for example, has a very high turnover rate, right? Whether it is before COVID or even now after COVID, and it continues to be a high churn industry. Have we really seen in Singapore the online shopping taking over consumer retail? I think it's intuitively you can see maybe more F&B in malls today than in pure retail as before. I think that's one sign. But has it completely taken away the need for malls? Definitely not.
Okay. Maybe one more question around like merchant networks, right? So, okay, you see there are all these malls, there are more and more malls in Singapore, and okay, maybe not more and more lah. They have already been established. The malls are there, and they have kind of anchored themselves as a big part of the consumer behavior in Singapore, right? And you see a lot of these so-called neighborhood stores or like merchant networks around that looks a bit more like still stuck in the past, not a lot of reinvestment, right? So, what does your data tell you about, these consumers? Where do they spend relative to from the malls to like the neighborhood stores, just so that, our audience get a good sense of like, oh, okay, actually most people spend most of their money here. They don't spend as much here, or the tilt has shifted, and all that.
So I would say that the more and more the heartland merchants that are not in the malls are moving towards digital payments, right? So definitely we have growth in digital payments in the heartland merchants, not in malls. And most of these heartland merchants belong or reside on HDB retail space, right? So this has really increased relative to those in malls. Malls continue to have their good contribution to payments, not just us, but I believe the rest. But because of our longer tail reach, I would say in the heartlands, we are able to say definitely with QR payments, more and more heartland merchants have moved towards digital payment.
Yeah, but are you seeing their business grow? Because now you have their data sets, right? So just so we get a sense on this front.
On a year-on-year basis, we are still growing, right? So that means I think given our relative share in the market, I believe the face-to-face merchant business is still growing. We see it from a digital payment standpoint. Singapore is not yet 100% digital, right? So maybe in a cash side, they are reducing or getting less.
There's a rebalancing
there could be
on
some,
that front.
Yeah.
That's just...
But definitely from a digital payment standpoint, we are seeing growth.
Maybe last word of advice for aspiring entrepreneurs, right? Not from the CEO point of view, it's on the data that you have, right? All the data that you have at the back, what would you advise some of the aspiring entrepreneurs? Other than look at data lah, because that one is people get it. They may not know how to do it, but they get it. Yeah.
I think definitely. I mentioned the point of the size of the pie and the right to win, right? I think those are very general. I mentioned about culture, eating strategy, which is also real but commonly said. And I did mention purpose. But if I were to choose any one of this, that to me really is important, whether you are a startup or whether startup entrepreneur or whether you are running an enterprise business, being able to motivate your team and drive the right culture, being able to articulate why we are here is important.
Fair. I think that is very well articulated, because recently I've been feeling a bit tiring motivating everyone.
You don't need to motivate me.
No,
I can't motivate.
It's a big part of the job, right? Right. And,
It is a big part of the
yeah,
job.
yeah. Okay. Thank you for your time.
No, thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Yeah. We hope you enjoyed today's episode on TFC Business Show. I think it's quite fun, right? To have Lawrence on the episode. And if you are another big CEO and you look at this and say, hey, you FOMO, you can email us. hello@thefinancialcoconut.com. We want to see you there. And if you're a regular listener and not on our email list yet, go to thefinancialcoconut.com to put your email address there so that we can route out the algorithm and reach you directly, right? Because we have a lot of events, we have a lot of things coming up, and we want to stay updated with you, and we want you to stay updated with us. Okay? So with that, that's it for today's episode.
Do not let the algorithm win.
Yeah. Must win the algorithm. Like, share, subscribe. Okay, put your comment in the comment section, and we'll see you in next week's episode of TFC Business Show. Meanwhile, take care. Bye bye.